This tutorial assumes you know the basics of using Blender. I'll begin by using a cylinder, and I set the origin to the 3D cursor. I rescale the cylinder to resemble a real-world scale of a metal 55-gallon drum. That is 34 inches tall and 23 inches in circumference. In edit mode, I add 4 horizontal edge loops. Move the top and bottom edge loops toward the top and bottom of the cylinder. I then space the other 2 edge loops out in the center of the cylinder. Add a bevel to these 2 edge loops to match the size of the top and bottom faces. I select all 4 face loops and scale them out along their normals. I select the outer edge rings of these extruded faces and add a small bevel. I inset the top face and extrude it down along the Z-axis. I add the same bevel to the new interior edge. I add a new edge loop close to the inset faces. I add horizontal edges between each of the extruded sections and move them close to the edges of the extrusions. This will keep these areas sharp. In object mode, I shade the barrel smooth. I add a weighted normal modifier to clean up the shading issues and apply it. I add a new cylinder, scale it down, and move it to the top of the barrel. I move it to the front of the barrel and make sure it intersects with the top of the barrel. I select the barrel and add a Boolean modifier, with the operation being difference and the object being the smaller cylinder. I apply the modifier and hide the smaller cylinder. In edit mode, I delete the internal faces. I select the edge ring and add a small bevel. I add another weighted normal modifier and apply it. In edit mode, I select the top edge loop and duplicate it, scaling it along the X and Y axis. I scale the edge to add some faces. I select the face loop and extrude it up along the Z axis. I select the inner and outer edge rings and add a small bevel. In object mode, I shade the barrel smooth. I unhide the smaller cylinder and scale it along the Z axis. In edit mode, I inset the top face and extrude it down along the Z axis. I also add a bevel to the edges. I add 2 edge loops, one towards the top center and one toward the bottom center to keep the edges sharp. In object mode, I shade the cylinder smooth. I now repeat the process for the smaller hole toward the back of the barrel. I split the viewport and open the UV mapping workspace. I select the horizontal edges and an edge down the back of the objects and mark the seam. I then unwrap the objects onto one UV mat. I select the sides of the barrel and rotate them 90 degrees. I select all the islands and use the Pack Islands option, making sure to deactivate the Rotate option. I make sure to apply all the transforms. I make sure all the faces are facing the correct way. The textures I'm using are linked in the description. I'll be using Affinity Photo to make some changes to a couple of the textures, but you can use whatever software you have access to. I start by cropping the sign to select the one I want to use. I then use the selection brush to select the white background. I use the backspace to delete the background and then deselect the image. I open one of the grunge textures I'm using. In order to adjust the color, I go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels, and change the selection to gray to achieve a black and white image. I also increase the black level. I export the image as a PNG. Back on the sign, I add this grunge texture to a new layer. Using the Move tool, I can scale the texture. I drag the grunge texture onto the sign layer to make a clipping mask. I select the grunge layer and change the blending mode to linear burn and lower the opacity. Then I export the image as a PNG. I also make a normal map for this image. I already have a tutorial showing you how to do this. The link is in the description. I split the viewport again and open the shader editor. I select the inner faces and bottom faces of the plugs and assign a material to them. I select the rest of the barrel and add a new material. I select the central faces and add a third material. I'll be using the Node Wrangler add-on. I make sure I am in material preview mode. I reselect the main barrel texture and import the textures using Ctrl-Shift-T. I increase the scale of the texture. To change the color, I add a hue saturation value node between the base color of the texture and the principled shader. Since I want a dark blue color, I change the hue to 290, saturation to 83, and the value to 0.8. I drag in a grunge texture and add a mix color node. I connect the grunge texture to the B input and the hue saturation value to the A input. I change the factor of the mix color node to 1. I connect the mix color node to the base color of the principled shader. I connect the color of the grunge texture to the factor of the mix color node. I add a color ramp between the grunge texture and the factor of the mix color node. I change the blend mode of the mix color node to subtract. I can use the color stops on the color ramp to control the grunge texture. I copy and paste the shader nodes from the barrel onto the center barrel material. I change the hue and saturation to 0 and the value to 3. I use Ctrl-Shift-T to set up the textures for the plugs. I increase the scale of the mapping node. Add a hue saturation value node between the base color texture and the principled shader. I change the hue and saturation to 0 and the value to 0.25. I copy and paste the grunge setup from the base material into this material. I adjust the color stops on the color ramp. I add a color ramp between the roughness and the principled shader. I move the white color stop to make the metal rougher. I select the barrel center material and add a diffuse shader node. I drag and drop the decal into the shader editor and connect it to the diffuse shader node. I drag and drop the decal normal into the shader editor. I change the color space to non-color and connect it to the normal of the diffuse shader. I add a mix shader between the principled shader and the material output node. I connect the diffuse shader to the bottom input of the mix shader. I select the decal texture node and go into edit mode. In the Data tab, I open the UV Maps panel. I add a new UV map and rename it. I select the faces where I want the decal to appear. I then unwrap the selected faces. I select the UV islands and move them off to the side. I use Ctrl-I to select the rest of the barrel. I select the islands and move them to the side. I select the faces where I want the decal and move them back onto the UV map and scale them accordingly, overlapping the front and back faces. In the shader editor, add a UV map node and open the default UV map. Add a mixed color node between the mapping nodes and the texture nodes. I connect the UV map node to the mixed color node. I add a second UV map node and open the decal UV map. I connect the UV map node to the decal texture node. I change the bounds of the decal texture to clip. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video about making a biohazard barrel in Blender, you may enjoy this video. Have a good day.